Today we are finally talking about my insane collection of 101 bin cages. We're talking about bin cages, the basics of bin cages, pretty much everything you need to know to decide if a bin cage is right for you. And I'll secretly be eating crackers the whole time. That is the most dry snack food I could have chosen. So what the actual heck is a bin cage? A bin cage, as you may have already figured out, is a cage made from a plastic bin. It really does sell itself. Yes, that's right, those storage boxes you see everywhere in all the supermarkets and all the homeware stores, those can be made into homes for your small pet. And actually, they're incredibly popular. I understand why people who are new to small pet keeping and who have never come across bin cages before may be extremely skeptical as to their safety and their durability and whether or not it's even okay to keep an animal in a storage box. As long as the bin is a decent size, as long as it's set up in an adequate way and has adequate ventilation, then they do make decent cages for hamsters, especially if you're on a tight budget. Some of you have come to me with concerns about the potential health risks that could come from using a plastic bin cage long term with a small pet like a hamster. Concerns in regard to plastic leaching, concerns in regard to plastic fumes, concerns in regards to BPA. But the reality is that there are absolutely no records of these being problems with keeping hamsters in bin cages, and people have been keeping hamsters in bin cages for many decades, along with, of course, the plastic commercial cages that came before them and that some people still use. Of course, if your hamster is actually chewing and consuming plastic, then yes, that is going to lead to health problems, of course. And if you decide to set fire to your hamster's plastic cage, then yes, the fumes are going to be a risk to their health, but it's going to be quite low down on the priority list in that situation. But the concerns about plastic fumes building up inside the enclosure over a long period of time don't really make any sense, because if that's happening, then your enclosure definitely does not have enough ventilation, and again, it's gonna be quite low down on your priority list at that point. So to summarize, are bin cages safe? Ding ding ding, yes they are. That came across a little bit sarcastic. Yes, they are safe. With so many commercial options available to you, why would you want to pick a bin cage? Well, it kind of seems pretty obvious. I think at least bin cages are significantly cheaper than commercial cages, and of course commercial cages more often than not are far too small to be keeping any living animal in, unfortunately. And the commercial cages that are suitably sized for keeping hamsters in are usually upwards of 60, 70, even 100 euros. Meanwhile, you can usually pick up a suitably sized storage box for anywhere from 10 to 30 euros. And in fact, you may be lucky enough to not have to pay anything for one if you already have one in your home that you can use. How big does your bin cage need to be? Well, it needs to be the same size as any other enclosure would need to be. The type of enclosure you have does not affect how much space a hamster needs. The absolute bare minimum enclosure that is considered acceptable to keep a hamster in long term is 450 square inches. Now, it is important to remember that bare minimum is not the same as recommended size. A lot of people still get those two mixed up. Bare minimum is just the absolute smallest acceptable enclosure size you can provide for that animal. If you were looking at a 0 to 10 scale for enclosure sizes, with 10 being the absolute biggest enclosure you can provide, then bare minimum sits on 0. It is the starting point, is the smallest you can go. I want to make a point of stressing that because I still hear a lot of people think that bare minimum is the recommended size and they aim for that size. You should be aiming for above that size. If you have your hamster living in a 450 square inch enclosure, that is technically acceptable, but it is no guarantee that that animal is going to be happy in there, because again, it is the absolute bare minimum size you can provide for them. Lots and lots of emphasis and stress on this. So when you're looking for a bin cage, just like when you're looking for any other enclosure, you want to go as big as you can possibly go. Keep in mind that a hamster's natural territory is larger than a human home, so you really cannot go too big with a hamster enclosure. More floor space equals more enrichment equals a happier, healthier hamster with a much higher quality of life. Size matters. Now, something you can't do, unfortunately, is to take two separate bin cages of, let's say, 300 square inches each and join them together with a tube or something similar, and then say that that cage is 600 square inches. That's not how floor space works, at least in regards to hamsters. With hamsters, floor space is measured by a single, continuous, open area of floor. Joining separate cages together like that does not create a continuous floor space. Those are individual floor spaces that are counted separately from each other. So you wouldn't have a 600 square inch cage in this example. You would just have two 300 square inch cages, and that would not be big enough for your hamster. You would still need at least one of those bins to be above 450 square inches. This would be the main enclosure, this would be the main area of floor space, and anything else added on can provide space for enrichment, can provide space for burrowing and all sorts of other things, and can be beneficial to your hamster, but it will not contribute to the main floor space. And I know how confusing all that sounds. It is a bit confusing. If you're absolutely dead set on having a bin cage and you can't find one that's big enough, you can join them together in a way that will increase the floor space, but it's a little technical. And I do need to be very upfront here in saying that I have never done this myself, I have never tried it myself, but I have seen other people do this, so I know it does work. The basic premise is that you take two or more bins and you entirely cut off the wall at one end of each bin, and then you seal those two bins together, thus creating a true continuous floor space. And you can actually create quite massive bin cages doing this, but the only thing I would say to be careful of is that when you're cutting off an entire end off a bin and then sealing two bins together, that is gonna have a negative effect on the structural integrity of the bin, and it's not likely that you'll be able to easily lift it up and move it around. So if you're gonna do that, what I would recommend doing, just to make things easier for yourself, is actually building your Frankenstein bin cage on a piece of wood that has wheels on the bottom of it. That way, when you need to move the bin around, you can just wheel it from place to place and you don't have to be lifting it up and potentially destroying the enclosure. But again, that is a DIY project that I have not personally tried. I've just seen other people do it successfully, so I'm limited on the advice I can offer you here. Technically speaking, a lid is optional. It ultimately is up to you whether you want to use one or not, but if you're asking for my opinion on it, which given that you're here, I guess you are, I strongly advise having a lid on every enclosure that you have. It is just not worth the risk of your hamster escaping, climbing out, getting lost, getting injured. And I'm gonna go a step further and say if you use a lid on your bin cage, try and get one that has locking clips on it. And if you can't get one that has locking clips on it, find a way of securing that lid down. Use some method to make sure that lid is securely tightened and can't just easily be lifted off whenever your hamster wants to squeeze out. There's going to be a small interval in the video now because my battery is flashing angrily at me, my throat is currently burning in pain from all the talking, and I am only about halfway through the topics I need to cover in this video, so I'm going to come back a different day and finish it off. And you have the privilege of basking in the magical glow that is video editing. Jump cut! It's a much colder day. Unfortunately, I can't be a great help with this because I happen to live in a different country to more or less the entirety of my audience. However, you should say a massive thank you to my Twitter birds who have been incredibly helpful in gathering together a list of places you can buy bins. If you go and take a look in the description box beneath this video or head down to the pinned comment, you will find a great big long list of links to suitable bin cages that you can buy if you live in the US, Canada, or the UK. Unfortunately, it's not possible for me to provide links to bin cages available in every country, but given that most of my audience comes from one of those three places, I figured this kind of list would be the most helpful. If you want to use or can only get your hands on a solid coloured bin cage, then you can use it. That should be perfectly fine. The only thing you have to be careful about is making sure that your hamster is getting enough light in there during the daytime to make sure that their internal body clock still functions correctly. Hamsters do need a natural day to night cycle, so during the daytime they do need to be able to get some daylight into their enclosure, and at nighttime they do need their enclosure to be dark. So if you are going to be using a non-transparent bin cage, it's extra important that you make sure those mesh windows are as big as possible to allow enough light in. And speaking of mesh windows, do bin cages really need them? Can't we just drill a bunch of holes in the top and in the sides? No, No, you can't. I do not advocate for just drilling a bunch of holes on the top of your cage and calling it a day. Ventilation is incredibly important for hamsters, for most small animals, because they have such delicate respiratory systems. Your hamster's enclosure must have adequate airflow to promote respiratory health, which means, at the very least, you need to have a large mesh window on the lid. With larger bin cages, you can usually get away with having just a mesh window on the lid, but if you're using a smaller minimum size bin cage, you'll also want to consider putting mesh windows on the walls as well. However, if you're going to put mesh windows on the walls, just keep in mind you need to leave enough space for deep substrate. Now, ventilation holes can be useful and you can use them as long as it's alongside a mesh window. So, for example, if you had a bin cage with a large mesh window on the lid, you could drill ventilation holes around the walls to provide side ventilation, and that would be perfectly fine. For some reason, hamsters seem to have this unearned reputation for being destructive chewers, when the reality is that destructive chewers are a very small minority in hamsters. Most hamsters do not chew excessively, and in fact, one of the biggest concerns that I hear from owners is that their hamster isn't chewing enough and they're worried about having dental problems. And I'm not saying that it's impossible or unheard of for a hamster to chew out of their enclosure, because it does happen occasionally, but the majority of hamsters will not do that. It's not a risk for most people. And if you do happen to end up with a destructive chewer, it's not a good idea to keep them in plastic enclosures anyway, or give them plastic toys. Destructive chewers should be kept in glass tanks and given wooden toys that are safe for them to chew on. Most of you will not have a destructive chewer though, and as long as your bin cage has been designed safely, there's no reason why they should chew their way out of it. So there's a bunch of different methods for making bin cages, but you guys strongly requested that I show you how to do this without the use of any power tools. So that's what I'll do. I will say the fastest way to do this is by using a Dremel or a jigsaw. The power tool free way is going to require time and patience, and that's just the compromise you have to make. So to do this, you'll need your chosen bin, 1 centimeter square wire mesh, zip ties, and a sharp craft knife or box cutting knife. These are very cheap, mine cost less than €2 and you can buy them almost anywhere. A couple of optional extras are a ruler, a marker pen, and masking tape. Before you start cutting, it's important to know where you want to cut and to make sure you're leaving a border of about 2 centimeters around the edge of the lid. You don't want to cut right up to those edges or you'll have nothing to fix the mesh to. I'm now laying down masking tape on the area I want to cut just to help give my knife some grip and reduce the chance of slipping or cutting any wobbly lines. Now just take your knife and start slowly scoring through the plastic. You probably have to run the blade over the same area a few times before you break through. It really depends on the thickness of the plastic as well as the blade sharpness. This is the part that makes it so time consuming. You just have to keep going and keep going and going and going, and then maybe consider investing in a Dremel. Once you've cut out the window, you need to make holes all around the outside for zip ties. The more holes you make, the more secure the mesh will be, and you can do this by using your knife once again, or if you have a drill, that would be much quicker. Now flip the lid so the inside is facing up and line up the mesh over the window. Secure it into place by threading zip ties through the holes of the lid and the holes of the mesh. Tighten them as much as you can and snip off the excess. Voila! Lid done! You can follow the exact same method if you want to make side windows as well. Just make sure you're placing them high up so there's enough space for substrate. And I think that's the whole video. That's it. We're done. Finally, Bin Cages 101, ticked off the to-do list. Thanks so much for watching it. If you want to chat with me, I no longer exist in the comment section. I gave it up for the new year, but you can find me over on Twitter at ErinRachel94. We have fun there, we make jokes, we make Photoshop nightmares, it's all good. And I guess I'll see you next time, so bye!